Hey, welcome to the Best Gay Sex Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Trevor Hoppy. Riddle me this. What makes you go blind, grow hair on your palms, and maybe even ruin your chance of having kids? Well, if you said masturbation, congratulations. You just might be the recipient of a really crappy American sex education. For literally centuries, American moral reformers have been doing the most to try to keep young men and boys from touching themselves. Sylvester Graham? He invented the graham cracker for exactly the same reason that John Harvey Kellogg invented cornflakes, to try to keep young boys from masturbating. It's true. Look it up. But as today's guest reminds us, masturbation isn't wasteful, and it's definitely not self-destructive. In the world of baiting, ironically, it can actually be a source of community. Bryan Bance has taken his love of self-pleasure to new heights as a competitor in Season 3 of BateWorld's annual Great Bake-Off. And I love saying that. It just makes me think of a really spicy British baking competition. But in the world of baiting, Bryan didn't just find pleasure, although, of course, plenty of that was to be found. He also found sustained, real, meaningful connection with other men and developed a certain kind of self-confidence about his own body. And he also really just learned to appreciate the male body and all of its messy, uninhibited glory. Let's listen in. Bryan Bance, welcome to the Best Gay Sex Podcast.
Hey, how are ya?
I'm so good. I'm so thrilled to see you again. We met over, I think, almost 20 years ago first, which is a number that is not logical to the brain, but is true.
No.
You were living then in San Francisco, and tell folks a little bit about your sort of growing up, like situate us back there in the Bay Area.
Yeah, so I am Bay Area born and raised. I kind of spent my time up and down the peninsula, I like to share. I'm originally from Redwood City. That's where I grew up. I went to college in San Jose, so on the South Bay. And then as soon as I finished that, I ended up in San Francisco, where I lived for about 8 to 10 years. That's where I met my now husband. And after growing up there, we made our way across the country and have been living in New York, mostly Brooklyn, since 2016. So we are coming up on 9, almost 10 years. I think that's when we can start to claim that we are New Yorkers.
Native New Yorkers, right? Exactly. Yeah. Totally. What's New York been for you? Like, compared to San Francisco, how do you feel they're different?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious thing is just like the sheer size of New York, right? Like I think New York compared to San Francisco, like New York obviously has the reputation of being like the city, right? And I think as someone who grew up outside of San Francisco for a long time, San Francisco felt like the city, and that's what we called it. But now that I've been here in New York, just the sheer scale and the sheer size of people feels just immensely different. And by comparison, San Francisco feels like a small town. And I would say even more specifically so, like the microcosm of, the Castro being the neighborhood, it got to a point where it's like, felt like I was seeing the same people over and over, which can feel like a good thing on one hand, but also can feel, get to a place where it feels monotonous too. So, just New York in general just exists on a very, very different scale than San Francisco.
100%. Like, I used to love walking around San Francisco. Literally, like, you could walk around the entire peninsula almost in a day and just have a nice little day of it. But in New York City, obviously, there is no walking around Manhattan. Like, you would be dead.
No.
Yeah, totally. So what does your day job look like?
Yeah, so I'm in this kind of interesting transition right now. So I'm currently a graduate student. I am back in school. I'm getting my master's in social work. It's an interesting kind of circle back to something I had thought about exploring when I was younger, but I ended up falling into a very different career path. I was a, retail fashion executive, which I hate even using that term, but I was in that field for about 15 before getting sick of the capitalism of it all, is what I like to say. And so I'm literally in the middle of my graduate program, and I really seek this path because I ultimately want to become a, queer affirming therapist in the end. I think there's, even in a big city like New York, there is still such a huge need for queer affirming therapists and more specifically, therapists who understand and talk about sexuality, being kink affirming, being gender affirming. And that's one where I have a lot of curiosity and interest and hopefully more knowledge. But again, I feel like there's a big need for it as well. And so that's kind of what most of my days are filled with is being back in school. And then aside from that, I do dabble in some, online content creation as well. Really kind of focus in on the kind of bator side of things, if you will. I've definitely kind of built up a reputation both online and here in New York as being part of the bator community. And it's a place where it really kind of fits in with what I like to do sexually, but it's also been a place where I've been able to build a lot of community and friendships with.
Yeah, this concept of baiting has become, I don't know, it's blown up, I feel like, overnight. I'm sure it's always been there, but it's having a moment. How would you define baiting?
I mean, it's really hard because as someone who's been, involved with it more and more over the past few years, it really has so many different types of people within it. And within baiting, there's so many kind of subgenres, if you will. I think that language is something that's really important. And we may talk about a little bit later, but having this definition of, a side or someone who enjoys non-penetrative sex is kind of, I think, what is behind this like moment of like where you're actually talking about it. But like we've all been jerking off and masturbating for a very long time. And it's just become this thing that people are finally comfortable and being able to use language around it. But it's like interesting as we talk about it having this moment, like, again, it has been around for such a long time. And one of the big things here in New York, specifically for the bator community, is this party called New York Jacks. And I mention it because it's basically a twice a week, party centered around masturbation. They kind of shy away from any sort of penetrative sex, but they, in the month of February, are about to celebrate 45 years of having this party. And
wow.
Yeah. And one, amazing that a party can last that long, right? But two, if you think back as like when that started, that takes you back into, the mid 80s. And a lot of these parties were born out of the necessity and what was going on with the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And we as queer people were trying to figure out what were ways to have safer sex with each other without the fear of getting sick. And that is really where New York Jacks emerged as an opportunity for people to connect sexually, again, without the fear of contracting HIV during that time frame. And so it was born out of this necessity.
I was just talking to Sister Tana Virgin. I don't know if you remember her from San Francisco days.
I do.
Love her so much. Yes. And so she was talking about voyeurism in kind of a similar way, that it kind of is a way to explore, especially in the face of epidemics like AIDS, in a safe way. So I appreciate that kind of history. Locating that. Obviously, a lot's changed since then. What does it take to be a baiter?
I think it's about being able to get in touch with yourself, right? I think, there's a lot of shame around sex in general. And I think that masturbation is something that's been viewed as something that could be shameful. And it comes from, yes, a very kind of puritanical and Victorian era thought. But I think a lot of that shame is also rooted in, a heteronormative mentality where any type of sex that couldn't possibly result in reproducing is sinful or shameful. And so I think to be a masturbator is to one, kind of reclaim that shame and understand that taking your own pleasure in your hands, quite literally, is really powerful. And so I do think that is kind of the first step of being a masturbator, is reclaiming and saying I'm going to have my own pleasure. I also think about that in the context of women too, and women being able to take their own, pleasure in their own hands as well. It isn't just a men only thing, but so reclaiming that power is really, really important. And what I've discovered, especially in the past few years, as I've kind of built up this friend circle of baiters, is that a lot of people may have the misconception that baiting is a solo activity. And yes, it is something you can do on your own, but I use that word community not lightly, because there is a big community of people who like to share their masturbation with each other, and whether that's in an exhibitionist voyeuristic way, whether it's online and video chat rooms, or it's, going to these parties like New York Jacks, and there's been a few others that have cropped up in New York City as well, and across the country. It is a place where people are able to come together, no pun intended, enjoy themselves. And I think, while I'm not part of like the leather community or like the pup play community, like I would have to imagine that they also feel that camaraderie and brotherhood, if you want to use that language, that siblinghood, if you rather, of just finding people that want to explore their sexuality in a similar way to you. So yes, it's about being in touch with yourself, but I've also found that it is about, being able to find others and enjoy the company of others as well.
Do you think there were early experiences that set you on this path?
Yeah, I think for me specifically, and I think this ties to both my discovery of masturbation, but also sex in general, is I've come to found that like I had a pretty unique and open kind of discovery of sexuality. I was a very curious kid, and I did a lot of reading as when I was younger. And as it relates specifically to sex, to masturbation, I stumbled upon this website, which still exists to this day, called JackNWorld. And JackNWorld, although it hasn't probably been updated in over 20 years, someone is maintaining the domain, which is fantastic. But JackNWorld presented masturbation as something that was one, so normal, and two, something that did not need to have any sort of shame attached to it either. And it was presented in a very like matter of fact and educational way in terms of like, here's how people can do it. And on top of that, here's a bunch of different ways you can explore your masturbation. And, it was everything from like, here are different like techniques, being like different hand grips you could use to like enjoy your masturbation. Here's different types of lubrications you can use. And like, you have to think like, I was discovering this as like a teenager when I was like 13, 14 years old. And like, I didn't have the ability to like go to an adult store and like buy lubrication. I had to use whatever I could. So it was like, we had baby oil underneath the bathroom sink. We had cooking oil in the kitchen, and JackNWorld opened my eyes to be like, oh, you can use those as a new way to discover, how to masturbate with yourself. But I really do think that it was a site like JackNWorld that just really normalized masturbation as something that so many people do. And, I think unfortunately, like I was saying before, because we're in this heteronormative and sometimes conservative values around sex, a lot of people have historically been taught that masturbation is sinful. And there were so many myths that were spread around of like, you're going to get hairy palms, you're going to go blind. Yeah, you're going to like bend all your semen and not be able to get someone pregnant later on if you masturbate too much. All of these myths have been shared for such a long time, but I'm very lucky that I discovered JackNWorld at an early age, and a lot of those myths were dispelled for me. And so, yeah, that was really kind of the point of JackNWorld and really set me on that path.
That's amazing. I love the idea that something as simple as masturbation, not simple, but not even innocuous. It's just this kind of sexuality that we think is entry level. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the first thing you do. Usually it's the first kind of sexual experience you have, most people. And yet it can be so disruptive still. Promoting and like normalizing masturbation can be so disruptive because of that stigma that is still there. Isn't that wild?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like I just read a book. I'm looking over at my bookshelf because it's right here. It's by an author, Dr. Eric Sprankle, and it's called DIY, The Wonderfully Weird History and Science of Masturbation. And he really kind of dives into the full history of, obviously kind of the Victorian era, kind of conservative values that came in, but then also what was the wrong science at the time about, again, what masturbation could do. It talks about Dr. Kellogg of cereal fame, was one of the proponents that wanted people to stop masturbating for various reasons. And so
graham crackers, same thing with graham crackers. People think it's just a delicious snack. No, that was supposed to be like a bland food that was going to make young boys not want to touch themselves.
And so, yeah, it's just, again, the misinformation that has been spread around masturbation and sex in general, but I think specifically masturbation is one that's been targeted so much. And I think that it's unfortunate if people don't undo that level of shame around it, because, to get what you were saying about like masturbation is such like an entry level, quote unquote, thing about sexuality. But for me, as I become a stronger or more associated with baiting and really involved it in my sexual practice, I do think that it's made me a better lover with other people. Like, there's no doubt that there's a connection between being in tune and in touch with my own body and being able to be a better lover with other people. Like,
Well, I was just going to say, is there a time you can think of that where you like were actively aware? You were like, wow, I'm doing something here with my partner, and this is something that I learned from this practice.
yeah, I mean, I think the first and foremost thing, and I remember learning about this on BateWorld, is the experience of edging. They described it as like, a stop and go technique, but being able to be in control of your body and realize, when am I getting close to orgasm, getting close to ejaculation, and being able to ease off on it and kind of pull back for a moment so that you don't go over the brink too soon. I think a lot of people, when they're having sex with other people, that is a common concern that they have is how can I last longer, especially if they're, being the one who's penetrating or is getting head or whatever it may be. And so I can definitely link my sexual acts with other people and being able to last a lot longer because I did practice stop and go techniques from BateWorld. I did learn to edge. And so I know that when I'm with people, if I'm getting close, I either need to kind of stop and pull back for a little bit, I can breathe, and then I can continue. And so again, that's one example of being able in tune with my own body through, solo sex that is made me a better partner for people.
Yeah, I appreciate that reframing of edging a little bit because when I first heard that term and came to awareness of it, it sounded like, I don't know, like, wow, you have a lot of time on your hands that you're spending all day doing this thing. And then I think you're right that for a lot of people, there's all this anxiety that a lot of men have about coming too fast. It's just a reality of our physical anatomy that unless we know how to control it, we are not able to. And so I appreciate that the edging can be, and maybe if it had a different word for it, I don't know. For some reason, the word edging has always rubbed me the wrong way. No pun intended. But yes, it can help you control your orgasm.
And at the end of the day, it also makes your orgasms that more intense. And like, some people love to do that as well. The sexual activity is be edged by someone else. And, it just makes your orgasm that much more delicious.
Yeah, definitely. And it takes a certain intuition to kind of understand someone else's body in that way to be able to read where is that brink and how do you stop in time to not go over that point. Do you have any tips for that?
I mean, I think, it's a practice makes perfect thing, right? I think a lot of people were so trained to like that the end of sex is orgasm. And so I think first and foremost, you need to reframe that like orgasm isn't necessarily the end goal. And if you kind of pull yourself away from that framework, I think that opens you up to realize that like the journey could be just as enjoyable or if not more enjoyable than the end point. I just think we're also trained to think that we have to orgasm at the end of sex, that it can get us in our head with like, let me get there quicker because if I don't, like, is there something wrong or what have you? So just remove orgasm and ejaculation from being the end goal can really help people kind of get into that mindset. And here's the thing. If you mess up and you accidentally come when you were trying to orgasm, guess what? You can do it again the next day. If you're lucky enough, maybe you can do it in, 15 minutes from then. But like, it's not the end all be all if you mess up once, and you have the freedom and your body will allow you to do it and practice it again very shortly afterwards.
Amen to that. I remember I was walking in Puerto Vallarta with a friend who had been to a tantric workshop, and he ran into the leader of this workshop, who was this beautiful, of course, just this beautiful man. And they were having a conversation about what it meant and how to practice this thing. And he grabbed my friend's junk and he was like, keep your sexual energy in here. And his challenge was to not orgasm, basically to hold it back. And I still think about that moment, even though I was not the one experiencing that interaction. It was profound in the sense that what would it mean to recenter male sexuality away from the orgasm? It's not an easy feat because every time we turn on television, when we see sex, it's over when the man comes. And it
happens in 30 seconds on TV. Like, you know what I mean? Like, exactly. And it's I think that again, for female identifying people or people who don't have penises, like orgasm is not always the end result for them. And sometimes it's not possible for them to achieve that with a partner. And so, again, it could help people who are not only in male-male, relationships to, again, remove orgasm as the end goal and realize there's a lot more pleasure to be found on that journey.
I think women have understood this a lot longer
Mm-hmm,
because
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
because I think most women will tell you in heterosexual sex that just like it is not common to have a vaginal orgasm, or maybe even possible for most or many women.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so the reality is, if you want to have an orgasm, it's not going to be that time when you're having penetrative sex, unless there's clitoral stimulation or other things happening. I guess men are a little late to this party, but it's nice to be reminded of the pleasure that can come from that for sure. Do you think there was like in this world you're in now, where you're obviously having other kinds of sex as well as baiting, like
Mm-hmm.
what is the difference between those two kinds of sexual interactions? Do you seek out casual sex that's not with your husband, that's not baiting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, for me, we were talking about like the definition of a side. Like, I don't personally identify as a side because I do enjoy and have and engage in penetrative sex. And, specifically, you're mentioning, my husband, like, he's not in that dating world, and that is perfectly fine because him and I have plenty of great sex, penetrative sex and otherwise with each other. I think for me, the distinction between like seeking out the masturbatory experience versus the experience of like penetrative sex is really kind of about different types of connections. I think that because there's so many different subsets of baiters, like there's kind of a lot of different ways you can connect with people. And some of it is about not connecting with them in like the ways that you would expect in penetrative sex. And so like when I think about like if I'm jerking off with someone, sometimes it's all about, you know, showing off for each other. And there isn't a lot of like physical connection and physical stimulation between the two of us. It's more about like being in the room with someone, showing off for each other. Sometimes there's pornography involved. We might just be watching that together. And so it like kind of opens up these different ways of being able to like find connection, even if it isn't physical versus, obviously if you're having penetrative sex, that is very physical and you are touching someone and you are, having a lot more kind of this physical proximity and closeness with one another. And so I think that's one of the ways that might be different between, penetrative and baiter sex. I think on top of it too, you know, the goal of baiter being kind of in a bait situation might be to really kind of savor that edging that we were talking about and really kind of get each other to that kind of point of almost coming and then pulling back and really kind of playing with that for a very long time. Um, I think the reality of the penetrative sex is that while we may hear about people who want to get for hours on end, like a lot of people are also very happy to like spend 20 to 30 minutes in that type of way. And like, then that's all their body can handle. And so I do think that there's a duration difference and mindset that might happen between, baiter sex and penetrative sex, if it makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. What about gooning? Where does gooning fit into all this?
Yeah, I mean, so I feel like that in particular has gotten probably the most publicity as I've seen more and more like think pieces and articles. And so like I think first and foremost, like gooning, for those who may not be familiar with it, is this idea of like getting so kind of like deep into your masturbation that it becomes this almost like hypnotic sense of mind and state of mind. Yeah, exactly. And so like there's a lot of people who kind of, might associate it with like being like dumb on your penis, and like you just get to this point where like you become one with your dick. Basically, it's kind of the mentality. And yes, it involves a lot of people getting, as they kind of go into this mentality, like a lot of like tongue being out and drooling. And I think not everyone, I think first and foremost, there's like a subset within the baiter community that identifies as gooners, and not everyone who's a baiter is a gooner. I think that people who get into that kind of, who identify as gooners, I think that they are kind of really taking a lot of freedom too. Like we were talking about reclaiming of like the shame that might be associated with masturbating. I think gooners are kind of taking that reclamation to an extreme point of like, I'm going to like be so into my masturbation that like I'm going to look as like free and stupid as possible. You know what I mean? Like there's some people that almost associated with like you're kind of like our Bator clowns in some sort of way. And I think an outsider looking in might look at it and say like it feels performative to some people, and who's to say, like maybe there are some people that are performing in that type of way, but I still think that even if they're performing, they're doing it in a way that's like freeing and trying to say like I don't care if I look stupid and I'm masturbating, like I love it anyway. Like so I think that there is a kind of a freedom that comes along with people that associate with that kind of gooner mentality.
Yeah, I mean, the impulse, I share that impulse a little bit to be like, is that real? What
Mhm.
is real? And you just have to
Yeah.
step back. We are always performing. Even if we're in our
Amen.
own rooms, we have
Hmm.
our own little security watch who's like, oh, you don't
Hmm.
want to do that. You want to look at the wrong things. You don't want to get turned on in the wrong way
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
experience pleasure in the wrong way. So I get that there is always a performative aspect to it. It looks great. Like I envy it. Like I would love to be in such a state of zenned out bliss.
Hmm.
I guess what I'm curious about with both baiting and gooning is how masculinity kind of figures into all of it, because it feels
Hmm.
very bro-y, and
Hmm.
I like part of that, but also as a gay man who was historically aggrieved by bros,
Mm.
it feels challenging. But maybe that's the point. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this too. And like, yes, within the beta community, there's a lot of, language and vocabulary that comes along with it. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Like, there is this like usage, particularly of the word bro, right? Like, people within the community call each other like, yeah, it's my beta bro, or hey, bro, let's jerk off together. And it does seem, very like masculine, male centric. That being said, part of it, I think, is that's like I guess the language is so important, and that's just kind of part of like being part of the community. But that being said, like I have met some very, very femme presenting and feminine, baiters in the community that kind of just flip into that language because it's just kind of part of what's expected in some ways. And so I don't know if I have the exact answer to it, but like I do think that it might be kind of again kind of reclaiming some of the shame of masturbation being a shameful activity, and because it's not having sex with a woman and being procreative, like is it less of a man thing to do? Like I've seen a lot of things on social media like from these like alpha male type of guys that say like men don't masturbate, stop masturbating. If you need to come, you come with a woman kind of situation. And so I do think that there is this reclamation of like, no, like masturbation can be a masculine thing. And just because you're not having sex with a woman for the purpose of the procreating doesn't make it any less of a valid form of sexual expression. I think the other interesting thing too within the beta community is that I would venture to say that especially like jerk off parties, there's probably a higher penetration percentage, if you will, of men who may not solely identify as gay. I think that bait off parties create a community and create a space that might be safe for men who are maybe, again, unsure of their sexuality or don't want to or are not able to come out for various reasons. If you want to use the term DL, like that's okay. And there might be also men who are straight identifying. I've definitely encountered quite a few at jerk off parties. And so I don't know how that plays into the masculinity piece of it as well. But I think on the flip side of this, being non-penetrative sex, I think that creates some freedom for people, for men in particular, to explore sexuality with other men without fear of it being quote unquote gay. And I just find that to be very interesting. And again, I don't have like numbers or statistics of other sex parties, but in my experience, I've encountered a lot more men who don't identify as gay enjoying masturbation parties specifically. And so that's like an interesting thing to throw in there as well of what dating can mean to people.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not like the way that straight men or gay men are going to heal our wounds together, but there is something appealing about the idea of finding a safe yet sexual space for straight and gay men to be in the same room together. That's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, yeah. It's I think you hear, or at least I've heard of stories of like, when we're all exploring our sexuality as, teenagers of like, you know, two dudes may have jerked off together and just kind of explored that as a, something when they were 15, 16 years old. But a lot of time then shame comes along with that. And so I think that, again, jerk off parties and even like a website like BateWorld is a place where I do see both bisexual identifying men, but also straight identifying men enjoying sharing their masturbation with other men. And I just think that that is yet another kind of place that people can kind of explore and reclaim their sexuality that was once thought of as shameful. And I just don't think I see that level of exploration of non-gay men in other, sexual communities as much as I see it. And
Yeah, I hear you 100%, and I think that resonates with things I've seen as well. And so it's just fascinating to think about. I am all for, especially as someone who's just lived life as a little queeny kind of young boy. My relationship to straight men is problematic. I have a long history of feeling it's very hard for me to open up and feel vulnerable with a straight man given all the things that have happened. And it's not rational, right? It's not specific to a specific person. It's just it's trauma, right? And for a moment, I just want to love and celebrate the idea of having masturbation parties to bridge that divide. So if you out there listening, I think it would be great to have more of those opportunities. I'm also on kind of a mission to find the good things about masculinity because it's been a tough subject, I think, my whole life, this disidentification I have with masculinity. I'm trying now in my 40s to embrace what does it mean to be a man? To be a man, right? Even just saying that feels like, ooh, because, you're just trained that men do so many bad things, and they do. But what about masculinity do you celebrate?
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like I have the same sort of like reaction when I think about like straight men. Like I think about like even my time in corporate America, which is, highly patriarchal and the way that it's structured. And I think about like moments where I felt uncomfortable were definitely in places where like men ruled, were the leaders in that kind of those types of spaces and feeling very uncomfortable in it. I think maybe similar to you and like probably a lot of other gay men, like my lack of masculinity was always questioned at a very early age. I mean, I remember, when I was, 5 or 6 years old, I used to like, and this is showing my age of generation, but like I used to play as like, do you remember Carmen Sandiego?
Yes,
Yeah.
that red jacket and that hat. Yes.
I mean, in retrospect, fabulous, right? I didn't understand why, but like I used to like pretend to be her. And like that was kind of like my like role play when I was like that age. And so like I feel like I do have a very kind of like fraught relationship with masculinity. And, I think for me, I've been trying to actually figure out how to actually make it's less about kind of like embracing the masculinity side and how can I make sure that the feminine energy is also just as respected as masculinity. Like I actually have a tattoo on my arm that says, let boys be feminine. And I think for me, that's not only like, yes, let them express themselves as feminine if that's the way that they are, but I think it is about what we associate with feminine energy. And that is about, caring for other people, being more emotional with one another. And so I think that in general, if we as a society embraced femininity and all that it encompasses, I think the world would be a much different and better place, in my opinion.
I agree, but I don't think we're going to get to the promised land unless we also reconfigure masculinity. And I used to be in the same place where I thought, well, we just need to embrace femininity more. And I think we obviously do. There's no question. But I also just think there's this elephant in the room and that's why I think straight men, I'm getting way off topic, but that's why I think straight men are leaving like democratic spaces and other things because there's been this, and I hate to say I don't want to say that we're man haters from like a feminist perspective or whatever, but like, there is this kind of refusal to look at masculinity in a positive light that I think can be challenging. And that's what I think I see in this bait. And I bring it up because I see it in this baiting world a little bit, that there is something going on that's kind of bro-y, kind of masculine in its tenor, but it doesn't feel violent, or it doesn't have those negative attributes. And maybe I just don't see those attributes, but it just doesn't feel that way to me. I don't know. Do you see any of that toxic stuff creep in there?
I don't I think it does come down to the fact of like, one, again, we're kind of reclaiming a lot of like tropes that maybe have been hateful against us. Like, I think a big thing of like, you see a lot of baiters do with like the flexing kind of thing. It's like a big kind of pose that we do. And again, like, I feel like that's a bit of like us reclaiming this idea of like what it is expected to be a man, what a masculine, like muscular man, like jerk off in a room with a bunch of other dudes. Like, you maybe wouldn't expect that of when you think of masculinity. Yes, you think of like being a bro, but like, what do bros do? Like, we're going to go out and get drunk and find a bunch of bitches. You know what I mean? So like
some chicks, yeah.
Right? And sort of like flip that on its head. It's like, no, like, I'm actually going to be really like, if you think about it, like jerking off with someone else, you're putting yourself in a very like vulnerable position. I mean, as any type of sex with someone else is, but I think, masturbation specifically, you're putting yourself, you're being very vulnerable with someone else. And so I think it is taking those tropes or those, stereotypical things and pulling it into a sexual space like masturbation does, that really, I think, is a way to like make us more vulnerable. And so, yeah, I can't really recall any moments where like I left a bait space in particular that was like, oh, that felt like toxic masculinity. Yeah. Despite all of like the bro talk and that type of thing, it still feels very queer in many ways.
Yeah, it's got that kind of fraternity aspect to it, and the like Greek way that it's like fraternal orders or whatever, brotherhood, those words you mentioned earlier that can be quite positive. So I'm just here to reclaim some of that, not necessarily reclaim, but to reimagine masculinity in this positive way and to celebrate that, and femininity, right? We have to do both, and
Absolutely.
and all the space in between. Anyways, I appreciate you letting me go down that little rabbit hole, because it's been my thing I've been thinking about a lot. If someone out there wants to get into baiting, what would you tell them to do?
I would say, first and foremost, the internet is your friend. And I think that there's a fantastic social media site that is centered around masturbation, and that is BateWorld. BateWorld has been around. They're celebrating 15 years this year. And it is a place where, you can create, your own kind of it's like a social media site. So you can create a profile, you can put pictures up. You can find people who are located close to you. If you're someone who doesn't want to take that step of meeting with someone in person, you can, they have a very thriving video chat room. And that's a place where I might spend some frequent time myself as an exhibitionist. It's definitely something that tickles my fancy. But I think that BateWorld, while I'll admit the website interface could use maybe some modernization, let's just say that, it is still, I think, the go-to place where people who identify as baiters or enjoy masturbation seek out. And a lot of people, find friends and find their community through BateWorld. You can also easily on BateWorld find local jerk-off clubs. Lots of cities nowadays have cropped up with these types of parties. Obviously I mentioned New York. There's some thriving ones in places like, Denver, Seattle, Chicago, San Francisco. Interestingly enough, I think one of them is finally kind of resurging. There was a long-standing SF Jacks that closed down, I think, pre-pandemic, and a different group is kind of picking up the mantle. But, I know it can be super intimidating to go to any type of sex party. But again, in my experience as someone who's been to both bait-centered sex parties as well as more quote-unquote traditional sex parties where penetration happens, you can kind of make it what you want, and I've never felt pressure to do anything I didn't want to at a bait party. And so I would encourage people to take that leap of faith and not to be afraid to go to a bait party, because every time that I go to New York Jacks, I leave with a new connection. And that has grown to now become, a group of people that I consider friends, and that, yes, we jerk off together, but we also hang out, get lunch, do drinks, and that type of thing. And it really has built up this community. And I think that for any sexual kink or fetish, that is something that we all seek out, as other people who can help validate and help us explore it in a safe way.
I'll just ask one more question about that, because I hear this from a lot of guys in many different ways, but a lot of guys have anxiety about size because there's just so much, in porn, it's a skewed perspective on what the male anatomy looks like. What would you tell someone who is anxious about that?
I have seen all different shapes and sizes of not just like dick size, but also just men in general. And again, as someone who's spent time in both types of spaces, I do find that the BateWorld, and I say that in general, not just BateWorld.com, but the baiting world is much more inclusive in terms of body types, in terms of age. Again, New York Jacks has been around for 45 years. There are some men that have probably been going for all 45 years who still show up. And so I have really kind of seen the gamut of people at this party. And because it is kind of a choose your own adventure of like whether you're going to like be heavily involved in touching other people, or maybe you're just going to sit back and kind of jerk off on your own, I have never seen anyone be rejected because of the size of their dick, the size of their body, or any of that type of thing. I do feel like it is a very inclusive community and space in general.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing to that, which helped me be comfortable with my own body and the way it is going to a Korean spa. I know that sounds wild, but a space where men are all naked, and it's not sexual to me. I don't go there seeking sexual entertainment or enjoyment, but I do get to see all the ways that men's bodies can look. And it made me just appreciate my own body so much more.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of San Francisco, like Kabuki, not a Korean spot, more Japanese, but Kabuki was a place where like, yeah, the idea of just, social nudity and sexuality, not, sex not having to be the end result of it, I think really does normalize just how different our bodies can be. And that's a wonderful and beautiful thing.
It's so validating, and I know that word is overused, but it's true. It really can assuage you of a lot of those fears and anxieties you have about your own body, because it's just a body. Like we are not models, most of us, and that's not just not okay. It's like good. Like we should celebrate those differences. Anyways, I'll hop off my soapbox there, but I appreciate that baiting those parties might be another opportunity to get comfortable with your own body, but it's hard in America.
It's so difficult. And like the prevalence of like social media and how we present our sexuality on social media, again, as someone who does that himself, like I think for me, like I'm not a guy who has, a built body by any means. I've never had a six pack. I don't think I ever will. And I think for me, part of the reason why I enjoy the showing off and having this online alt world that I live in is that I wanted to be able to like, again, I'm using this word a lot, but like reclaiming my own body and being comfortable with it, and realizing that like, I don't have to like hide it, even though it's been so ingrained, especially in queer and gay men, that like, this is the archetype, how you have to look like, you have to be, at one point it was smooth, slim, like, that type of, body type was what I grew up seeing as from a sexual perspective. XY magazine, Queer as Folk, right? Like it was so ingrained for a long time that to be able to like show off that I have a different body type than that it's very validating and very, sexy as well. And so it is difficult, but I think that once you get to a point where you feel comfortable, like at least for me, it's like I will never kind of like go back to feeling ashamed about my body.
Amen to that. And that is a tough mountain to climb. So I applaud you for getting to that point, because it's really hard. And it's not just for gay people. Like growing up, I remember family members saying a lot if someone was shirtless on the beach or something who didn't have a perfect life. It's like, oh, no one wants to see that. Just those little, we might call them microaggressions, but just those normative statements about what a body should look. And the funny thing is that it's not like those family members, they look the same. It's like, and so, they're just projecting their own feelings about their own body, but it has this negative effect on everyone else. So I appreciate you celebrating what a body looks like, what a fabulous, lovely male body can and does look like, because that's brave in this world. And I don't know, I'm applauding of that. So thank you.
Yeah. I know you saying like being shirtless to take me back to like, I was the kid that like left his shirt on the beach or the pool and that type situation. And so I think it's wild that I, at this point, feel comfortable with showing the entirety of my body, my whole naked body online. Like I came to that realization last year that's like, wow, like you have come a long way. And yeah, I appreciate you saying that you're proud, because I'm proud of myself too, if I'm being honest.
Good. You should be. I was that same kid. And like, I remember I have come a long way in recent years. And I remember taking my shirt off with my family at the beach, right? Like such a non-event event. But, and my little niece being like, why are you naked? And it was just a funny moment because, to her that was naked, and I don't know, that makes my heart break a little bit, but I'm glad to take it off and show and celebrate what a body can look like. So
absolutely.
Anyways, well, this brings us to our final segment, which I like to call Sordid Lives and Untold Tales, or SLUT for short. What's the sluttiest thing you ever did?
I mean, as someone who has lived and explored sexuality for a long time, it was hard for me to narrow it down. But I'll bring it to what we've been talking about and something kind of bator focused. So in October 2023, my birthday is in October. I had been going to New York Jacks for a while and had kind of built up a relationship both with people that went there, but also a few of the folks who organized the party. And so I decided in that year to celebrate my birthday at Jack's. And so kind of in coordination with the organizers of the party, we promoted it online. People knew, or I was hoping that people would know that it was my birthday. And lo and behold, when we, got to the party, which was like a Sunday afternoon, it was so heartwarming and also very sexy to have a bunch of men come up to me and be like, oh, it's your birthday? Like, and, come up to me and give me like a, a little kiss or maybe a little, tug on my penis type situation. And the hottest part is that at the end of the party, I ended up becoming the bukkake boy, if you will. And so to then have, I honestly lost count of how many people it was, but to kind of be the center of attention, to literally have all of these men like come all over me was one of the most kind of like hottest experiences. And I left there, one, sticky and messy, of course, but two, also kind of like, yeah, my heart was warmed because I was like, it did feel like I was celebrating this part of me on my birthday and doing it in such a kind of a public and communal way. And so, yeah, I think that is one of kind of like the sluttiest kind of bator-centric things that I've done. And I enjoyed it so much that I did it again this last year in October. So who knows? Maybe it now will become this kind of annual, birthday tradition where I get to celebrate it with a bunch of other, bators and jerk-off party. So that's the one that comes to mind for sure.
I love that so much. That is a fabulous way to spend your birthday, if I do say so myself. Well, if people listening want to learn more about you or see this content that you are producing, where can they find you?
So I am on several different platforms. My @ is XYBKBry. So you can find me on Blue Sky, you can find me on BateWorld, and you can also find me on Just for Fans. Yeah, that's pretty good.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Bryan. I appreciate your love for baiting and sharing it with the world.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
That's our episode for today. Thank you, as always, so much for listening. And remember, if you're not having your best sex, I'm here to help. My services as a sex coach can help you identify and overcome those obstacles that are standing between you and your best sex life. Find out more on my website, thebestgaysex.net. See you next time.